The stamp on the fourth document was still damp when I realised I'd made a catastrophic mistake. Not because the document was wrong, it wasn't. Every signature was mine. Every figure matched. The stamp was from a licensed notary, the paper was government issued, and the transaction was perfectly legal. That was the problem. My name is Gary. I spent 31 years in logistics, import, export, intermodal freight. The kind of work where a missing signature on a bill of lading could strand 40 containers at a port in Laos and cost a client $200,000 before lunch. I understood systems, I understood documentation, I understood chain of custody in a way most people understand their own names. And when I retired to Bangkok at 58 with $340,000 in liquid assets and a plan I had stress-tested from 14 different angles, I was absolutely certain that if the paperwork was right, I was protected. I want you to hold on to that word, protected, because somewhere around the 14-month mark, I finally understood what it actually meant to be exposed. The apartment I found in the Silom district had a balcony facing south. Not a view exactly. Bangkok doesn't really do views, it does layers. But on clear mornings I could see the Chao Phraya through a gap between two residential towers, brown and wide and indifferent to everything happening on its banks. I ran a morning coffee routine like a military operation. Same brand, same press. 7 minutes, balcony. 30 minutes of reading before I opened a single application. Some men fall apart when they retire. I structured my way through it. The first week, as the building manager's assistant knocked on my door about a mail sorting issue. She was in her early 20s, working her way through a real estate management diploma, and she very politely asked if I'd signed up for the registered mail service at reception. I hadn't. She walked me through it. The form, the authorization box, the clause that allowed building staff to accept registered items on a resident's behalf if they held a standing signature on file. Efficient, professional, polite in the particular Thai way that contains no performance, just function. I signed the form and thanked her and thought nothing more of it. I should tell you, I've thought about that interaction a lot recently, specifically about the authorization box. What I was building in Bangkok wasn't retirement in the conventional sense, but sitting by a pool watching my savings decrease is not a system I was ever going to tolerate. I'd done the research. I knew the space. Within 3 months of landing, I intended to be generating income, not just spending it. The only question was how fast I could move without moving stupidly. Fast, as it turned out, was not the problem. The first month I attended a business networking event in Sathorn, the kind held in a hotel conference room that's been partitioned off with temporary dividers and lit with portable LED strips, where the canapes are too small and everyone's business card is slightly different from their actual job. I go to these things as a matter of discipline. You don't build anything by sitting in your apartment reading. I work the room in the way I'd learned to work freight terminals, methodically, without urgency, yet always listening for the specific detail that tells you whether the person across from you actually knows what they're talking about. I met a man there, Canadian, 53, 6 years in Bangkok, who ran a small freight forwarding operation out of Lac Krabang. He'd been trying to expand his B2B client list into mid-size manufacturing and was drowning in admin. I knew that space better than he knew it himself. We talked for 40 minutes. By the end of the evening, I had a consultancy arrangement sketched on the back of a parking receipt. 47 hours a month, remote first, with a retainer structure I'd used in 2 previous contracts during my working years. It wasn't clean from the start. That first month, I logged 62 hours and got paid for 47 because neither of us had formalised the scope properly. I docked myself, sent him a revised scope document the following Monday. 12 pages, annexes included, Incoterms breakdown, escalation clauses, the works. He called me 20 minutes after receiving it and said it was the most organised thing anyone had sent him in 6 years of operation. He paid the outstanding hours within the week and asked if I could bring in a second client from his referral network. I could. I did. The second client took 11 approaches over 6 weeks before he agreed to a discovery call. Non-round numbers matter in logistics. I told him his current freight cost per kilo on his primary import lane was almost certainly 12% higher than it should be because of how his freight terms were structured. He asked me to prove it. I sent him a 3-page analysis built from publicly available shipping data and 30 years of pattern recognition. He called back within 48 hours. We had an arrangement by week 7. Month 3, 87,000 baht. That was the number that mattered. It meant I was covering my asylum apartment, my modest operational costs, and putting 31,000 baht back into the liquid reserve each month rather than drawing it down. The plan was working. The paperwork was right. I relaxed, slightly, carefully, in the way a man who does not really relax allows himself to. And then, because it was going well, and because I am not someone who confuses professional discipline with emotional intelligence, I allowed myself to admit something I'd been carefully not admitting since I landed. The apartment was quieter than I wanted it to be, and I want to be clear about what I was not looking for. I'd watched enough men in their late 50s arrive in Bangkok and immediately attach themselves to the first woman who showed interest, usually at a cost that started at a casual dinner and ended somewhere significantly more complicated. I had a 3-point vetting framework that I did not articulate to anyone but applied without exception. 1. Employed. 2. Not financially dependent on me before trust was established. 3. Not interested in me primarily because of what I represented as a foreign retiree with a visible income. I said this framework out loud to exactly one person. Del, a Texan from my logistics years who'd retired to Chiang Rai after stints in Dubai and Singapore. He said, and I am quoting him accurately, "Gary, a woman who passes a 3-point vetting framework is a woman who knows what a 3-point vetting framework looks like." I told him he was being cynical. He said he was being educational. We argued about it for 20 minutes and then talked about freight rates for another hour because that's what Del and I do. I went back to the methodology. The first woman I met through a dating app had a business importing Korean cosmetics. Impressive on paper. But on our second meeting, she mentioned with complete casualness that her import license was registered under her brother's name because the fees were lower that way. Something about that didn't sit right. Not morally, just structurally. A woman who routes her business through someone else's registration for convenience will route other things through other structures when it suits her. I stopped after 2 meetings. She texted 3 times afterward. I didn't respond. The second was an English teacher at a language school in Bangna. Warm, funny, genuinely curious about things outside her own immediate experience. I liked her, but on our third meeting she mentioned that her previous relationship with a British man had ended because he couldn't support her mother's medical costs, and she'd decided she needed someone more financially stable going forward. She said it without malice. She meant it as honesty. It was honest. I thanked her and didn't call again, and I want to be clear that I don't think she was wrong for saying it. She just wasn't what I was looking for. The third was a kindergarten teacher from Nonthaburi who was so visibly uncomfortable with the age gap that every conversation felt like a job interview she was too polite to terminate early. We both knew by the time the main course arrived. I paid the bill and wished her well, and she looked relieved when she walked out. I was beginning to wonder whether the vetting criteria were simply eliminating everyone, which would mean either the criteria were wrong or the pool was wrong, and I wasn't prepared to accept either conclusion without more data. So I went to a second Sathorn networking event, slightly better organised. The dividers were proper conference walls, and the catering had improved marginally. And I was standing near the window with a glass of water when I saw a woman at the financial services table who was reading an actual printed document with actual handwritten margin notes while the conversation around her continued without her participation. She wasn't being rude. She was simply doing something more important than performing sociability. I found this immediately credible. Her name was Juanita, 31. Junior accounts assistant at a mid-size import company in the Bangkok district. She handled VAT reconciliation, foreign currency transactions, and the specific administrative frustration of managing accounts payable for a Thai company with European suppliers who used 3 different invoicing formats and considered none of them a problem. We talked for 25 minutes about freight documentation as it related to accounts payable. She asked sharp questions. She challenged one thing I said, politely but clearly, and when I reconsidered, she was right. She took my card. She texted me the following morning with a follow-up question about CIF versus FOB terms and how the difference affected her company's landed cost calculations. I answered in detail. She thanked me, said it had resolved a filing issue she'd been working around for months, and that was it. No suggestion of meeting again, no indication of personal interest. I texted her 4 days later and asked if she wanted to have coffee. She said yes. We dated with a deliberateness I respected. She did not ask me about my financial position for the first 6 weeks, not my assets, not my property situation in the States, not what I was earning from the consultancy. She asked about the work itself, the freight industry, the shift toward digital tracking, the way Chinese manufacturing patterns were reshaping Southeast Asian logistics lanes. By month 3, I had told her, without being asked, because I believed financial transparency was the foundation of a serious relationship, exactly what I had in liquid assets, what the consultancy was generating, and what my monthly operational costs looked like. She listened. She asked 2 clarifying questions, both structural. Then she showed me her payslip. 28,500 baht a month after tax. She offered it without being asked. I respected that more than I can explain. She initiated physical intimacy, clearly without confusion, on a Saturday evening after dinner near the river, which I state that because it matters to the sequence of events. She moved into the asylum apartment at the 4-month mark. Before she did, she insisted on contributing 6,000 baht a month toward household costs from her own salary. Her suggestion, not mine. I told Del about this specific detail. He said, sure, Gary, in the register he uses when he has a fully formed opinion he's decided isn't worth arguing. I should have asked him to argue it. The proposal happened at month 6. I spoke to her father before I spoke to her, in person, at his home in the Lat Phrao district, which is a Bangkok neighbourhood the way a freight terminal is a Bangkok neighbourhood. Functional, unglamorous, built for throughput. We discussed the sinsot. I proposed 350,000 baht. He countered at 420,000. We settled at 380,000, of which 220,000 would be ceremonial, displayed at the wedding, returned privately afterward per a written agreement between her father and me. I paid the full ceremonial figure. The returned portion came back within 10 days. I had that exchange documented. The marriage was registered at the district office. Legal. Witnessed. Stamped 3 times by 2 different officials. I read every document before I signed it. One of my friends from the logistics years called me the evening I was helping her move the last boxes into the bedroom. Del. He'd heard through a mutual contact that I'd married. He said, "She'll take everything, Gary," and laughed the way Del laughs when he believes something completely and would rather you also believed it but isn't going to make you. I told him the paperwork was solid. He said the paperwork is always the mechanism, Gary. It's never the protection. I told him he'd been in Chiang Rai too long. The first 8 months of marriage were, by every observable measure, exactly what I had planned for. The consultancy had grown to 3 active retainers. Monthly income had reached 114,000 baht. Juanita was still employed at the import company, still paying her own phone bill, still contributing her 6,000 baht monthly to household costs. She came home with freight terminology questions occasionally, genuine questions rooted in actual filing problems she was working through. I answered them. I enjoyed answering them. There was one Thursday evening, I can place it precisely, when she came home with a quality of distraction I hadn't seen before. Not troubled, it more like a person running a calculation they need to finish before they can be fully present. I asked if everything was all right. She said there was some administrative complexity at her company, accounts related, a filing issue she was working through. She made dinner. We watched something after. The evening was entirely unremarkable. I know now exactly what she was finishing that evening. The first demand came in month 9. We were sitting on the balcony on a Sunday afternoon, the gap between the towers, the river visible in the distance. And she told me that her father's situation had become more complicated. The debt from his failed construction supply business had accumulated interest she hadn't been aware of. A creditor had made contact. The figure she mentioned was 180,000 baht. As I want to describe her delivery carefully because the delivery was precise. She did not ask me for money. She said, "I need to find a way to help my father with this." Then she waited. I had never done anything like this before. In 31 years of business, I had maintained a clean separation between professional obligations and personal finance. The discomfort I felt in that moment was specific and identifiable. Not guilt, not sympathy exactly, but the particular unease of being positioned in front of a decision that has no clean answer. Something felt wrong. Something else said, "This is what family means, Gary. You married into a situation. This is what that means." I told her I understood the situation was difficult. I told her I was not in a position to treat that kind of transfer as a gift. Not because I didn't care about her father, but because I had a principle about financial decisions made under time pressure and emotional weight. I proposed a structure. I would lend 180,000 baht to her father directly, documented with a simple agreement, repayable over 24 months at 0 interest. No profit motive, just structure. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That is more formal than I expected." I told her I understood that, and that the formality was not a reflection of distrust. It was how I handled every financial commitment, personal or professional, without exception. She accepted. The agreement was signed. Her father received the transfer within the week. The tension passed. She thanked me. The following weekend, she cooked a full-time meal. 5 dishes, everything from scratch, the kind of effort that communicates something words don't quite cover. I thought we had navigated it well. I thought we had found the register that worked. 6 months later, the register shifted. By then, Juanita had been added as co-director of my Thai consultancy company, a decision I had made 3 months into the marriage, when it seemed natural, when she was managing aspects of the household administration and had a better grasp of Thai corporate filing requirements than my original setup allowed for. The company structure was standard for a foreign national. Thai majority shareholder, as required by law, operational authority protected through a management agreement and a power of attorney my business lawyer had drafted. Adding her as co-director felt like the obvious next step for a woman I trusted completely. 8 months into the marriage, she raised the question of a joint bank account. Her reasoning was logical. Household finances were split across 2 accounts. The friction was unnecessary, and financial transparency between married adults was a sign of maturity, not vulnerability. She didn't ask me to move my full liquid reserve. She asked me to deposit operating funds, household costs, shared expenses, a contingency buffer. She suggested 1,200,000 baht as an initial deposit. I transferred it within the week. We both had debit cards. Both had full transaction visibility through the bank application. I checked it every 3rd day. 3 months after the joint account opened, I was presented at the bank with an addendum to the account terms. And the original dual authorization threshold, requiring both cardholders to approve transfers above 50,000 baht, was being adjusted upward to 500,000 baht. The document was presented as routine account maintenance. My signature was required alongside hers. I read it. I understood what the threshold change meant. I signed it because 500,000 baht seemed like a reasonable floor, and because the system seemed sound, and because I trusted her. I have read that document 43 times since. It says exactly what I thought it said. The second demand arrived 4 weeks after the threshold addendum. We were eating at a restaurant near Lumpini Park, a place she liked. Good Tom Kha, the kind of low-lit room that Bangkok does well. When she told me that her mother had been diagnosed with a cardiac condition requiring a procedure, and the hospital she wanted was a private facility in the Ratchathuri district. The cost of the procedure, she said, was 340,000 baht. She did not phrase it as a question. She said, "I don't know how we handle this." Then she looked at me. "I can pay for medical treatment for a family member." I told her that clearly. What I told her I could not do was transfer 340,000 baht from a shared account without a structure that protected both of us. Not because I doubted her mother's condition, but because a transfer of that size without documentation created a precedent I wasn't prepared to establish. I would pay for the procedure. I would not pay cash to a family member on the basis of a verbal description of a medical bill. The hospital would receive payment directly, or I would need to see the medical documentation and cost estimate first. She looked at me across the table and said, "Is this how you treat family, or is this how you treat everyone?" I said, "It is how I treat every financial commitment, without exception. That has not changed." She was quiet for a long time. Then, "In Thailand, asking for documentation from family is an insult." I said I understood the cultural weight of that. I said I was still going to need documentation. I was not going to apologise for that. I told her I had an alternative to offer. If the medical need was urgent and the documentation would take time, I would advance 170,000 baht immediately against the documented total. Half now, half when the cost estimate came through. I told her I could cover medical costs, but I was not going to bypass my own process for any single expenditure above 100,000 baht, regardless of the circumstances. But she accepted the first payment. The documentation arrived 10 days later, a legitimate cost estimate from a legitimate private hospital. I paid the remaining 170,000 baht directly to the hospital billing department. The procedure went ahead. Her mother recovered well. I sat with that for a week. The discomfort didn't fully leave. There was something in the way the second demand had arrived. The framing, the location, the "is this how you treat family" line. That felt rehearsed in a way I couldn't place. I decided I was being paranoid. I had behaved with integrity on both occasions. I had found fair resolutions. She had accepted them. The paperwork existed. I told myself, if this is the pattern, I can manage this pattern. I was wrong about what the pattern was, and the 1-year test I proposed to myself was not something I stated to her. It was a private calibration. I gave myself 12 months from the second demand to observe the financial dynamic without adjusting my behaviour. If in 12 months there had been no further requests outside the documented household structure, I would conclude that the 2 demands had been genuine and situational, and I would revise my assessment upward. If there were further demands, I would know what I was dealing with. 11 months into that test, my accountant called. He called at 9:47 on a Tuesday morning. He does not call. He emails. The fact that he was calling told me, before he said a word, that whatever came next was not a routine matter. He asked me to confirm whether I had authorised a series of outgoing transfers from the joint account to a company called Meridian Accounts and Logistics Consulting Company Limited. I told him I'd need to check. He told me the transfers totalled 10,847,000 baht across 4 transactions over the previous 14 months. I sat down on the balcony chair. The gap between the two towers was there. The river was there, brown and wide and indifferent. Each transfer had my name on the authorization. 3 had come from the joint account, each below the 500,000 baht threshold I had signed away dual authorization for. The 4th had been processed as a contracted service fee from my Thai consultancy company, co-signed by Juanita in her capacity as co-director for administrative and translation services rendered. The service contract was on file. It's signed by me, dated 11 months prior, in a document package I had signed alongside 3 other operational agreements on the same afternoon. I remembered that afternoon. I did not remember that specific contract within it. Meridian Accounts and Logistics Consulting Company Limited had been registered 6 weeks before Juanita had suggested opening the joint account. Registered in her name. Its stated purpose was Import Logistics Consultancy. The language on the founding documents, the scope of services, the industry terminology, the framing of the business model, was my vocabulary. Freight terms I used, industry language she had absorbed across 18 months of knowing me, and which she had reproduced on a legal filing that now held 10,847,000 baht of my money. Dell had been right about the mechanism. He had just named the wrong document. I thought about the 2 demands. The father's debt, the mother's procedure. A combined 520,000 baht, fully documented, paid through correct channels. Principled, fair. I had been so focused on managing those transactions correctly that I had not asked what function they served. They had served a function. They had told her exactly how I would respond to a financial request, what language I used, what threshold triggered the documentation requirement, what a fair resolution looked like to me. She had filed that information and built the structure around it. She had not forged anything. She had not stolen anything by any definition a Thai court would easily accept. She had used the joint account I agreed to, the authorization threshold I signed, the co-directorship I offered, and the service contract I signed without sufficient attention. She had used the system I built. She had used it better than I had. When the accountant finished, I was on the balcony. I stood there for approximately 4 minutes after hanging up. Then I walked back inside. Juanita was in the kitchen. I stood in the doorway. She turned and looked at me. There was no performance on her face, no calculation, no guilt. What I saw was a person who had known this moment was coming for a long time and had made her peace with it long before I had any reason to. It was not cruelty. It was not triumph. It was something closer to patience. She told me, clearly in the precise register she used for every financial discussion, that each transfer had been authorized under account terms I had agreed to, that Meridian was a legally registered company with documented service contracts, and that any challenge through civil litigation would cost more than I would likely recover, given the documentation supporting her position on every transaction. She had already spoken to a lawyer. She said it without raising her voice. Imagine if you had believed the 2 fair resolutions meant the pattern was manageable. You would have waited another 12 months and lost another cycle of income while the directorship remained in place. I said one thing. I said, I built this system. I handed you the keys. I won't pretend otherwise. Then I called my accountant and instructed him to begin removing her from the consultancy company directorship immediately and to freeze my authorization access to the joint account pending legal review. She did not try to stop me. She had already moved what needed moving. The settlement took 4 months. Her legal team was efficient. Mine was better, but documentation constrains what better can accomplish. She kept the joint account balance, 340,000 baht remaining, and a portion of the consultancy company's retained earnings her lawyers argued she was entitled to as a registered co-director under Thai commercial law. We successfully challenged 2 of the 5 claims her team brought. The net position, when the accounting was finished, was 10,847,000 baht gone, and approximately 1,100,000 baht recovered. The math was what it was. I kept the consultancy. I kept the Lakrabang client, who had by that point referred 2 subsidiary accounts generating more monthly income than the original retainer. I kept a portable skill that required nothing but a laptop, a reliable internet connection, and 31 years of pattern recognition that no joint account structure could hold and no service contract could transfer. The freight industry does not pause for personal disasters. I have always found that grounding. 6 months after the settlement, I was in Ho Chi Minh City. Same consultancy structure, different lawyer, different jurisdiction, adjusted for Vietnamese commercial regulation. No co-directors, authorization thresholds reviewed line by line before signing. By month 8, I was at 92,000 baht equivalent per month. The mechanism worked in Vietnam exactly as it had worked in Bangkok. It had always worked. What I miscalculated was not the mechanism. It was the assumption that a contract is as trustworthy as the person co-signing it. And that understanding a system is the same thing as controlling it. 2 kinds of men survive long-term in this part of the world. The ones who understand from the beginning that documentation describes an arrangement between people and is only as reliable as the people who made it, and the ones who learn that lesson at a cost they have the resources and discipline to move past. Everyone else calls the paperwork a system and calls the system protection, and finds out eventually what those words actually mean when someone understands them better than you do. The building manager's assistant who walked me through the registered mail form in my first week. I think about her sometimes. She explained the authorization clause carefully. She was doing her job correctly. Oh, that is all documentation ever does. It explains a system clearly so you can operate within it. What you authorize inside it is still entirely human, and it carries entirely human consequences. The smile on Juanita's face that evening was not what I thought it was when I first saw it. I've had time now to understand it. It was the expression of someone who had known from the beginning that the real chain of custody in any financial relationship is not the documentation, it's the relationship. She had managed both. From that first Sathorn networking event, with the printed document and the handwritten margin notes, right through to the moment she waited quietly in the kitchen for me to figure out what she had already known for 14 months. The keys were always mine to give. That's the part that doesn't go away. Next week, I want to tell you about a man who thought the company structure was the safest part of the arrangement. He'd been in Thailand 9 years. He wasn't wrong about the structure.